This is the third session in our 4 weeks of talking about the poetry and the music and the issues of war and peace and survival that are helping BCCO celebrate its 50th anniversary, offering wonderful top-rate masterworks in classical music free to the community. And so you should all know that we are going to be singing Benjamin Britten's War Requiem for 3 concerts the first weekend in June. It is going to be stupendous. It is an enormous undertaking. We are working very hard. It will be at Hertz Hall on the university campus, so please tell all of your friends to come. It's a free concert. Where else do you get to hear such wonderful music without having to pay an entry fee? And so tonight, to talk about Wilfred Owen and the poetry around the period at that time in World War I, we're very, very fortunate to have C.D. Blanton, professor of English at UC Berkeley. He came to us about 10 years ago to UC from having taught at Princeton. He's also the director of the graduate program in the English department, a specialist in modern British and Irish poetry, and the author, I'll read you a couple of his titles here. He's the author of Epic Negation, The Dialectical Poetics of Late Modernism, and he's the co-editor of 2 volumes of post-war poetry, British Poetry After Modernism, and a concise companion to post-war British and Irish poetry. He is currently working on a project on the end of modernist aesthetics, and he loves lit crit, right? And so without further ado, C.D. Blanton, who is going to give us a wonderful talk.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation to join you and to join too in marveling in some awe. Simply at the ambition of undertaking the War Requiem, going back and listening to the original recordings over the last couple of weeks, and the various iterations that the work has taken since 1962. One is continuously reminded of the enormous formal complexity and the enormous intricacy of the work. Should I pull this back? Is this? Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that will be any better, but all right. The enormous intricacy of Britain's undertaking, and as I understand it, over the last couple of weeks, you've heard from my colleague Eric Falsey, concentrating on some of Owen's work and the particular textures that have, I think, distinguished Owen among this cohort of so-called war poets, and to some degree self-nominated war poets. And I know you've heard too about Britten's career and the stylistic approach to the Requiem in the wake of the Second War, debuted, of course, to mark the reopening of the Coventry Cathedral, destroyed in November of 1940. And since we have those coordinates in place, the main thing I wanted to do was just to take the occasion to step back a little bit and to try to grapple with what strikes me as one of the fascinating sort of contradictions or problems or sort of remarkable achievements, really, involved not only in the War Requiem, but more particularly in Britten's usage of Wilfred Owen and the figure of Owen as the kind of ground and the given of the particular idea that the piece develops in, I think, remarkably subtle and often surprisingly complicated ways. I say this by stipulating a couple of things, which may seem to contradict what I've just said. The first, of course, has to do with the War Requiem itself. which I think it's fair to say, for all of its grandeur and all of its intricate complexities as a musical piece, nonetheless relies upon the power of a fairly simple gesture. The Requiem itself, the kind of ritual quality of its performance, the setting of its original performance, the symbolic arrangement of the way that Britain managed its debut. All, of course, are designed in a way to leave a kind of certain underlying point unmistakable. That is to say, the elegiac force, or the commemorative force of the Requiem itself is, of course, the main unshakable point. And it is the sort of slow performance of what Owen himself referred to as a kind of deferred elegy that the piece undertakes. On the other hand, of course, Owen's work is at its best, I think it's fair to say, also defined by a certain simplicity. That is to say that Owen, this at least he learned from his mentor and friend Sassoon, at his most powerful, does not undertake to be sly or complicated, but rather to be direct, if in a more elusive way than Sassoon and some of his colleagues. But what I want to sort of turn over as a thought and begin to suggest here is that those two simple gestures taken in concert, those two simple programs, as it were, marked by Britain and Owen respectively, actually fuse in something that we might now begin to recognize as an enormously complex gesture on Britain's part. That is to say that Britain, writing in the early 1960s, obviously looking back to 1914, 1918, but looking perhaps most importantly in Britain's case through the kind of filter of the experience, or in some ways crucially the non-experience, of 1939 to 1945 and the Second War, manages to construct a relay of historical references and to construct a sort of slowly opening gesture that is itself made by the Requiem and depends upon Owen as a kind of anchoring figure and force. To get at that complexity, we need to provide both a poetic and a historical context, not only for Owen, but for the general cultural place of these figures that we group together as the war poets. Some of you probably know that a few years ago, a general plaque was added to Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, including a lot of the familiar names of this generation, including Owen and Sassoon and others. And it's an odd sort of commemoration in that it is, of course, the only such marker which includes more names than one, which gestures to an entire generation rather than singling out a singular talent, whether it be Alfred Tennyson or Edmund Spenser or Geoffrey Chaucer. That cultural position and the collective grouping of the war poets is itself part of their force and part of their memory, and it is also very much a concerted act of what we might call critical and political propaganda, predicated on a particular cultural history that begins to take shape within the war itself. To get a sense of this canonical formation of our general idea of war poetry, I think it helps to try to put Owen in context. It is something of a critical truism when we look at all of the names that we associate with this group: Rupert Brooke, John McCrae, Ivor Gurney, Isaac Rosenberg, Edward Thomas, Sassoon, Owen himself, that they form the kind of heart of a poetic generation. That's both true and not true. There were actually a variety of styles that could fairly be described as a certain kind of war poetry. We might look to what would be recognizable in the wake of the war as the emergent avant-gardes, figures who were working across the arts and who were very much touched by the shadow of the events of 1914. In fact, the painter and novelist Wyndham Lewis, himself one of the most radical figures of the pre-war avant-garde, once referred to himself and his friends as the men of 1914. But by the men of 1914, he did not actually mean figures like Sassoon and Owen. He meant himself and Ezra Pound and James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. Of those four, only Lewis himself actually served in the war. Only Lewis himself was, of course, a British subject at the time. And so we have a kind of division in the artistic scene that we could point to, which comes together around this moment of 1914. We could also point to a number of other figures closer to Lewis in their styles who do serve and who write remarkable poetry about their experience in the war in a more fractured and abstract and imagist style, figures like Richard Aldington and T.E. Hume. We could also point to a series of figures who take a very different approach in the years after the war, having survived the conflict. Robert Graves, David Jones, and develop a style that looks quite different from that of Owen or Sassoon. But what seems to bring this group of war poets, the real men of 1914, I suppose, as even Lewis might have admitted, together, is that for all of the variety of styles and accents, they all share a certain cultural place. Most are of the educated classes, most are university men, some are younger, tied in to the center of the cultural scene. A figure like Rupert Brooke is very close to a number of the figures in Bloomsbury, including Bertrand Russell, Maynard Keynes, Virginia Woolf, Roger Fry, and others. Some are older, Edward Thomas, almost a generation older, who along with his best friend Robert Frost, lives off in the English countryside before running off to enlist. But what all of these figures share is a kind of formation in the years before the war, which seems to put them at the end of something, that seems to make them the apotheosis of something we usually call Georgian poetry. A recognizable style that's lyric, that's direct, that is the stylistic embodiment of an ethos that is somehow opposed to the events that are depicted in the poetry. And it's largely this sense of an opposition, I think, that gives us the sense of the specialness of the World War I poets. There are a number of World War II poets that we could quote, that we could read, but by and large we don't in the same way. It's those of 1914 and 1918 to whom we return. These poets tend to make for convenient symbols, but that symbol is often somewhat deliberately ambiguous in itself. Those of you who are on the way to the plaque in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey pass through the front doors will recall that the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior sits apart from all of the other memorials in Westminster. And that sense of sitting apart, of being essentially set apart, of having been produced and defined by an experience that is not finally assimilable to the experience of those around one, is, I think, a crucial part of this aesthetic as well. There's also what we might mark here as a kind of narrative of the development of the war itself. And here, just a little bit crudely and oversimplistically, I'll point to a series of figures who can help us to understand some of the cultural work that Owen does in his kind of posthumous career. Very early in the war, quite famously, of course, after the outbreak of hostilities in early August of 1914. On all sides, one could see, as one often does in these things, a kind of political optimism that the war would be short, that it would be decisive, that it would not become what in fact it became. This attitude is in fact visible on all sides. The original German plan, as some of you may know, calls for a large sweeping gesture through Belgium around Paris, then moving back to the east, which on the German side looked very promising for a while until, of course, bogged down into what was soon recognizable as the mode of trench warfare that had settled in by the end of 1914. That early German success also punctured some of the optimism on the English and French sides. And so slowly through the opening months of the war, there is a slow adjustment of expectations, but there is nonetheless a kind of recognizable patriotism too, probably most firmly associated with the figure of Rupert Brooke and his corner of some foreign field that will be forever England. The tragedy, of course, is that Brooke dies very early in the war, and his attitude, his sort of optimistic, at moments almost jingoistic, sort of approach to the conflict, seems in a way to be frozen, to be arrested by that fact of his early death. What sets in the first couple of years of the war is a more ironic and a more distanced sense of the conflict. And here I would point to a figure like Edward Thomas, as I say, a little bit older, had established a literary career, unlike most of these figures, before enlisting, and who tends to write about the war by not writing about the war, by writing poems that are, in some sense, made by their setting in the experience of the trench, but actually do the work of trying to recall some more bucolic, often pastoral space back home, which has been lost in this experience, and which maintains an ironic distance from the actual experience of what is transpiring before the poem itself. Thomas himself is killed in 1917, I believe, as in fact are most of the figures that we'll mention here. The real turn that we often mark with the kind of critical bite that associates with someone like Owen is most visible in the early work of Siegfried Sassoon, who, unlike Owen, often undertakes the work of lyric poetry as a kind of propaganda, who, in fact, in testifying before Parliament and publishing the papers in London, undertakes to demonstrate, especially to the British public, how little it understands of what is actually happening in its name. Sassoon himself survives the war, but under his particular influence, Owen and a number of the later poets in the conflict begin to adopt a much more disenchanted, a much more brutal style, one which does not flinch from representing and not particularly attempting to transfigure or transform the experience of the conflict itself. And, as we'll talk about in a moment, an approach that also begins to insist on the distance between the experience of the poem and the experience of its readership. Owen, working very much under Sassoon's tutelage, adopts many of these attitudes, takes on many of these sort of basic presumptions that we associate with Sassoon. But he also turns them, and he also complicates them in a distinctive way. If someone like Sassoon very much wants to get across the point that he cannot possibly be understood, we might think of Owen as the figure who demonstrates this, who systematically works through this impossibility of understanding and makes it part of the poem itself. Under Sassoon's sort of mentorship, Owen's place then often seems to stand at the far end of this narrative of the development of war poetry. Owen himself is the youngest of the figures I've mentioned. He is, in many ways, has the most recognizable place in a longer English poetic history. His obsession with John Keats, his fascination with the experiments in rhyme undertaken by a young W.B. Yeats, and a maturity of voice that many of the other figures I've mentioned never quite seem to achieve. There are, of course, also, as I'm sure most of you know, the circumstances of Owen's death. Killed a week before the armistice, attempting to cross a canal in northern France. Famously, the news of his death arrived back to his hometown within an hour of the sounding of the bells of the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. So in that sense, too, Owen has often seemed to mark the end point, the culmination of this emergent canon of a kind of record of the war. So if that's the kind of historical narrative that brings us to Owen, and I think brings Owen to Britain, Britain looking on the other side of this history and sharing with many of his friends and contemporaries, figures like W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender, Cecil Day Lewis, and Louis MacNeice, a kind of odd sense of coming after this generation that never happened, and then having experienced a later chapter in this larger conflict. It is Owen who, more than anyone else, seems to embody that kind of embittered history of the 1918 settlement. But there's also a formal specificity to Owen that I'd like to linger over, for just a moment. I mentioned Sassoon's often rather polemical approach to his audience, his tendency to thrive on ironies that are finally bitter ironies. Sassoon, too, is a deeply ironic poet, but his ironies, I think, are a little bit different, a little bit more detached, a little bit more elusive. They turn on a mode of inversion. Those of you who know one of his more famous poems, Dulce et decorum est, will remember that the poem, in effect, pivots on the reworking of this famous old line from Horace, "It is sweet and right to die for one's country," which it now refers to as the old lie while describing the rather horrifying death of a comrade in a gas attack. It's the maintenance of those two reference points at once, the figure choking inside, literally drowning inside a gas mask, against the line from Horace, that Owen wants to maintain, wants to keep in place, and wants us in each case to hear in its full force. This mode of inversion or ironization is in a way what Owen does best. Those of you who have been working through Britten's score will of course have had a kind of education in Owen. And it's interesting to think about the pieces that Britten chooses to set as part of the Requiem, beginning and ending with two of Owen's more famous poems, but in the main avoiding some of the most anthologized and best known pieces in favor of shorter, simpler lyric settings. But I do want to provide and take a look at one poem that Britten doesn't use, though I think perhaps more than any other single piece, it sort of hovers over the kind of posture and attitude upon which Britten is counting and which he's putting to good use. This is the one that's passed around the room, I think. What is offered here is actually the printing from Sassoon's edition of 1920, the first appearance of most of Owen's work in print, with the brief and famous fragment of a preface referring to the pity of war and insisting that the poetry was in the pity, and a slightly larger contextualizing preface written by Sassoon himself. As you see, this comes very early on in the volume, after A Strange Meeting, which Sassoon sets at its head. And the Latin title, again, as with Dulce et decorum est, gives us a sense of Owen's sort of double ear, his movement back into that poetry in which he was taught, sort of classicizing tradition, against which the tone of the poem itself will concertedly work. I too saw God through mud, the mud that cracked on cheeks when wretches smiled. War brought more glory to their eyes than blood, and gave their laughs more glee than shakes a child. Merry it was to laugh there, where death becomes absurd and life absurder. For power was on us as we slashed bones bare, not to feel sickness or remorse for murder. I too have dropped off fear behind the barrage, dead as my platoon, and sailed my spirit surging wide and clear past the entanglement where hopes lay strewn, and witnessed exultation, faces that used to curse me, scowl for scowl, shine and lift up with passion of oblation, seraphic for an hour, though they were foul. I have made fellowships untold of happy lovers in old song, for love is not the binding of fair lips with the soft silk of eyes that look and long by joy whose ribbon slips, but wound with war's hard wire whose stakes are strong, bound with the bandage of the arm that drips, knit in the welding of the rifle thong. I have perceived much beauty in the hoarse oaths that kept our courage straight, heard music in the silentness of duty, found peace where shell storms spouted red as spate. Nevertheless, except you share with them in hell, the sorrowful dark of hell, whose world is but the trembling of a flare, and heaven but as the highway for a shell, you shall not hear their mirth. You shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mine. These men are worth your tears, you are not worth their merriment. As the title suggests, this is probably the closest thing, aside from the fragmentary preface, that Owen left to a kind of ars poetic, a kind of theory of his practice. But here too, we are confronted with a series of insistent ironies. Even the title sends us in two directions. In its English sense, an apology for my poem might seem to be contrite about what is to follow. In the Latin, apologia pro poemate meo has none of that sense at all. An apology here is not defensive, it is rather more aggressive. That division of tone winds through the poem as we seem to be shown one by one a series of images that do not quite predict the responses to which they are yoked. That is to say, the war has in some sense trained a series of responses to become counterintuitive, to become surprising, to become to us at least illegible, perhaps even inscrutable. In fact, it's that difficulty of interpretation, built on an irony of the Sassoonian sort, but here more pervasive, and here more complex, that I think gives Owen his particular force and gives this poem much of its power. But we can also look more directly at the turn the poem takes and begin to notice a series of still more surprising inversions, I think. In the antepenultimate stanza, I have perceived much beauty in the hoarse oaths that kept our courage straight. Famously, Owen insisted that he was, by the time he was writing in 1917, 1918, no longer particularly interested in beauty in its recognizable and its familiar forms, but instead in a mode of truth. But here, of course, he's maintaining a language of beauty, and he's aligning it with truth. He is insisting that that which seems not to be beautiful has been left as the content of his poem's claim to beauty. The contradiction in this case is a little bit attenuated, but Owen will quickly sharpen it. I have perceived much beauty in the hoarse oaths that kept our courage straight, heard music in the silentness of duty. We are now, of course, fully into the range of paradox. Found peace where shell storms spouted reddest spate. Beauty, music, peace. The three fundamental and organizing terms of the poem, but each, of course, has been redefined by way of a contradiction. Each has become the opposite of what it should have been. And then the real rhetorical turn of the poem, nevertheless, except you share with them in hell the sorrowful dark of hell, whose world is but the trembling of a flare, and heaven but as the highway for a shell, you shall not hear their mirth. If you think about it, this is rather an extraordinary claim. What he is telling us is that the poem that we have just read, we have not read at all. We might think we have scanned the words, we might think that we have followed this far, but he is now fundamentally revoking any pretense we might have made to understand what he is talking about. In effect, we are simultaneously being posited as the poem's audience and being denied a place in that audience. This kind of division has become a sort of structuring principle, and with those last lines, it becomes still more aggressive. You shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mine. These men are worth your tears, you are not worth their merriment. Notice what the poem has done over its larger course, too. You shall not hear their mirth, you shall not come. Your tears, you are not worth. We end on a kind of drumbeat of the second person, an accusatory you. But remember, too, where we started. I, too, saw God through mud. I, too, have dropped off fear. We've moved from a persistent first person to a persistent second person. The poem has taken us from I to you. But in the course, it has excluded us from the experience of that I. But we also have the strange rhythm of I, too, saw God through mud. I, too, have dropped off fear. One of the things that seems to be smuggled into the very grammar of the poem here is a kind of comradeship, a kind of collectivity, a kind of membership in some larger order from which we as readers, putatively civilians, back home somewhere, have been excluded. I too, however, suggests that for someone else, not including us, this poem remains legible. And here I think we come as close as anywhere else to what we might take of the kind of crux of the sort of social ideal that seems to work through so much of war poetry, Sassoon, Owen, and indeed beyond. If in fact the experience that one encounters in the trench is so intense and is so unbelievable, this sort of discovery of mechanized warfare, the sublime horror of everything that one is seeing, the unprecedented quality of the slaughter, the absolute senselessness of the numbers involved in that slaughter, then of course it follows that a civilian back home cannot possibly grasp what we have no category to describe. But those who can are those who are also sharing the experience. That involves not only one's comrades, famously it also involves those whom one is fighting. And of course, this poem on which Britain ends the War Requiem, perhaps Owen's most famous, I think certainly his most ambitious, Strange Meeting, stages this as systematically as any poem in the canon. The recognition of a kind of identity with one's enemy, the very figure that one killed yesterday, who suddenly one encounters in hell. Now, for very good reason, Britain, in turning to the War Requiem, I think wants to grasp some of the power of that core conceit. He, of course, wants to reach for that notion of a kind of self-recognition that we see in Strange Meeting. But there's a problem. Owen has, of course, excluded Britain, along with the rest of us, from this audience. He has, in fact, excluded everyone who has not shared this experience, which by definition has to include Benjamin Britten, a member of a younger generation, born, in fact, I believe, within a year of the outbreak of war in the summer of 1914, who shares no part of the experience, who is indeed a pacifist, a conscientious objector, who could never possibly have grasped the particularities or the force of this experience. Britain has no access to this particular authorizing experience, though he needs some version of Owen's hope retrieved from it. We can see parts of that desire famously in Britain's casting of the Requiem, I think. The voices from Germany, from the Soviet Union, from Britain, all of them sort of aspiring to some notion of comradeship that is, of course, staged most directly in the concluding movement through Strange Meeting. But this is the problem of the gesture. This is where the simplicity of the Requiem and the simplicity of Owen's basic insistence that we can have no part of his poetry leaves us in a state of paradox. Well, this strange division between civilians and combatants forms, as I say, a kind of refrain that one encounters throughout the work of the war poets, a kind of unbridgeable gulf. And it leaves us in this strange situation of being forced to read a poetry that we seem to understand, even as we're told we cannot possibly understand it. All while gesturing at the kind of loss of experience that characterizes our relation to the war, when compared with the excess of experience that characterizes Owen's or Sassoon's or Thomas's or Brooks' experience of the war. For the war poets, Owen and Sassoon and their generation, the conflict from 1914 to 1918, for obvious reasons, marked a kind of historical singularity. It was unprecedented. It couldn't be imagined that such a thing was anything except the most extreme exception to what one experienced as history or thought was history to that time. And that sort of assumption that there is nothing with which we could compare this of course, anchors this gesture of exclusion, anchors this strange version of a lyric poetry which actually advertises the fact that it cannot convey to us the experience in which it's based. Now, we should notice the formal ambition of this. Most of us think of lyric poetry as the particular and special domain of experience, right? Poets go out, and in a Wordsworthian vein, they experience the world and they bring it back to us. They deliver some part of that intensity to us. But it's the intensity of non-delivery which is being advertised here. It's the intensity of exclusion. Well, Britain, of course, is forced onto this conundrum in a variety of ways. And we should note some of the small touches that I think probably at some level of self-consciousness organize his approach to the Requiem. I mentioned the circumstances of Owen's death. Outside of a couple of small poems, very little of this material was published in his lifetime. Much of it, including Strange Meeting, a famous preface printed in 1920, were discovered among his effects by Siegfried Sassoon, who edited a slim volume, which we have a sample here, in 1920. We should notice the strange editorial provenance of that. It takes a figure like Sassoon, who has survived the war, to deliver to us a figure like Owen, who has not. And in many ways, the later history, this critical propaganda that I referred to earlier, of the canonization of the war poets, depends equally on these two kinds of figures, those who died and those who cultivate and curate their memory in retrospect. The next edition, slightly fuller, of Owen's poetry will be edited by Edmund Blanton, another war poet, another survivor, who again devotes the coming decades to the cultivation of this memory and the sort of canonization of this particular formal style. When Britain undertakes to write Owen's work into the War Requiem, then, there is a sly and subtle gesture being made. In effect, Britain is putting himself in the line of Owen's editors, figures like Sassoon and Blanton, who have, of course, arranged editions, anthologized, reworked, remade, reassembled Owen's work posthumously. It's a rather audacious little twist in some ways. For Britain, again, a figure with a very different background, a very different experience, to presume that he could, in effect, join this particular genealogy, including Owen, Sassoon, Blanton, and so on. But I think the Requiem itself, in addition to everything else it obviously is, has also to be read as an edition of Owen's poems, selected by now Benjamin Britten. We can hear a slightly larger version of this effect in the form of the Requiem, right, which with its mixture of a high Latin ritual form and a kind of vernacular mode in poems like Anthem for Doomed Youth or Futility, replicates one of those characteristic Owen effects. Think again of Dulce et Decorum Est, with its line from Horace, delicately balanced against a line like gas, gas, quick boys. That effect, that sort of jarring juxtaposition between the Latin and the English, also becomes part of Britain's underlying formal procedure. But I think the conundrum is still there. It's still not quite clear how Britain can claim the authority to place himself in Owen's position in quite this way. We can hear the sort of jarring version of the effect very early on in the Requiem. In fact, I would suggest we can hear it in the very first notes. As clearly many people in this room know better than I, the first sound we hear in the War Requiem is the sound of the bells that in a sense announce the commencement of the piece. And the first words we hear, the first poem of Owen's that is used in the Requiem, is famously Anthem for Doomed Youth. But I want to hear what goes on in Anthem for Doomed Youth, just very, very simply for a What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle, and patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. Notice two details there. The insistence with which the poem first frames the bells, the very bells which we have just heard, but which the poem insists we should not be hearing. What passing bells for these who die as cattle, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. Choirs, of course, soon to be heard, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. From the very first notes of the Requiem, Britten is not only using this sort of mascot figure of Owen, he is also working through at a very finely grained level the figures of the poems that he has chosen. But what is so strange here is that in each case he seems to be contradicting what the poem says. There are no bells, we hear bells. The choirs are merely the demented choirs of wailing shells, and we, of course, hear a very different kind of choir. Now this, in a sense, takes some courage. Britten is not only using Owen, he is also using Owen against himself. He has already presumed to place himself in the position of Owen and his generation, and now, having presumed that, he is quibbling with the very thing that Owen has given him. And again, I go back to this basic question. By what right, by what authority does Britten manage that? Well, this, I think, sort of step back for a moment, begins to give us a sense of the complexity of the gesture that Britten imagines with the War Requiem. I think it's true, as I've suggested, that Britten bears a kind of uneasy or ambiguous relation to the attitude that Owen crafts for himself. But there is, of course, a difference. And that difference is expressed not so much in formal terms, but rather in the historical coordinates that the Requiem traverses. In a sense, if I have to give the punchline and answer the question of what gives Britten the right to do what he's done with Wilfred Owen, the answer is very, very simple, and it can be summed up in a phrase, and that's Coventry Cathedral. Coventry Cathedral. Owen and Sassoon had, of course, imagined that this particular experience was so rare that it could not possibly be conveyed. And their poetry despairs of ever getting the point across in any satisfactory way. In a sense, then, we are left with an aesthetic, as Owen tells us in Apologia Propomate Meo, that is predicated on failing, that cannot possibly represent, cannot possibly express, cannot possibly communicate. The poetry here simply cannot work as poetry. It cannot do what poetry is, we thought, supposed to do. However, historical experience can. And of course, where Owen and Sassoon were in some sense not entirely right was in the assumption that the years between 1914 and 1918 were a singular historical experience that could be bracketed off from the years before and more particularly from the years after. And one of the things that Britten undertakes in a Requiem is a kind of projection, is a kind of extrapolation from the work of Owen, which in hindsight and in retrospect takes the force of the problem of what Owen and Sassoon couldn't see. That in fact the events about which Owen was writing were not the events of 1914, 1918, they were perhaps more properly the events of 1914 to 1945, or even beyond. In fact, I think one could fairly argue far beyond. This is in a way the great argument of Derek Jarman's version of the Requiem, this extrapolation beyond even 1945, and this insistence that what Owen discovered as a kind of singularity had in fact become the fact of the century itself. Right? So, how exactly does Coventry Cathedral solve the problem? Coventry Cathedral, of course, rather iconically, though not uniquely, registers the crucial difference between 1914 and 1945. In 1914 and 1918, as Owen and Sassoon never tire of insisting, the experience of the populace does not match that of the combatant. But between 1939 and 1945, indeed across the larger period, what we have discovered, or what history has discovered in the interim, is that that distinction, that division is broken down. In fact, in this later war, in this later history, it is civilians, like combatants, who form the sort of subjects of the experience of this event. That the events that began in the trench do not stay there, that in fact they move outward into what is now more terrifyingly still, perhaps, recognizable as a kind of experience of a universal event, no longer distinguished, no longer separated off, but now almost globally expressed, everywhere visible, everywhere available, differently experienced to be true, but leaving no particular outside, no place from which one could fairly say that one was not implicated in the events of a kind of present moment. In that sense, Britain's basic argument, and I think it is an argument, I think it's not merely a performance, it is a kind of argument, is that that quality of experience which marks the work, the best work especially, of the war poets, iconically figured in someone like Wilfred Owen, with his particular history, with his particular sort of recognizability, his particular poetic afterlife, has now become a kind of common property, has now become a generalizable aesthetic, has now become something that can be read, perhaps, for the first time. Coventry Cathedral, with its strange design of a modernist architecture now awkwardly juxtaposed in the old ruins, thereby offers a kind of diagram, a kind of blueprint for the Requiem itself, mixed out of these unmatched pieces, and as it were, retrospectively going back and now exerting a claim on the ability to understand and literally to speak with Owen's words that would not have been possible even a few decades before. There's a strange way in which for Britain, I want to suggest counterintuitively, Owen has begun to make sense after 1945 in a way that he could not possibly have made sense after 1918. But I'll stop
You're entertaining questions.
Of course.
Okay, so just raise
I
your
don't
hand.
promise answers. But.
Questions? Just go ahead, please.
Yes.
First, thank you very much for an excellent talk.
Well, thank you.
And second, my question is, were there many German poets who wrote about their experience in the war? Because I don't know of any of them, and are they in translation?
Yeah, and in fact, there is probably not the same critical cult or the same underlying dynamic which has as much to do with the British class system in some ways as anything else that gives us these figures, Sassoon and Brooke and Owen and such. But in fact there are. And it is one of the remarkable facts that on all sides of the European war, one does have a kind of remarkable turn to literary production, and still more remarkably, that most of it takes the form of a kind of lyric poetry. It's an odd thing if you think about it. The idea that the lyric poem would be the suitable vehicle for this particular kind of content. But yes, and in fact, the best couple of anthologies in English have undertaken to juxtapose English and German work, and the work of a much later poet, late John Silken, both poet and critic. It's a very fine work on trying to reestablish a more, how to put it, a less Anglo-centric notion of conflict. Now, it's not true, of course, that every poetry that we would associate with the First War takes this particular lyric style. And in fact, a couple of the figures I mentioned early on work in a very different mode. But one does see something like Owen, a sort of late version of German Romanticism that finds its kind of last guise in the work of figures who are in many cases directly involved in the conflict.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if there's this sense that Owen is writing about an experience that cannot be shared by his readers, and throws that in our faces, who is his intended audience? What is he trying to achieve by writing that kind of a narrative?
Yeah. There is an odd way. I mentioned some of the other things that were happening contemporaneously on the artistic scene, and one of the figure I mentioned in passing, the Wyndham Lewis, the self-conceived leader of the men of 1914, along with Ezra Pound, published to rather brilliant or unfortunate timing, depending on one's point of view, I suppose. In June of 1914, I believe, an enormous broadsheet journal in bright pink lavender wrappers with huge black type moving diagonally across the cover. And it was just titled Blast. And Blast was the first kind of explosion of a certain London avant-garde that later gave us all these figures I mentioned, Lewis and Pound and Eliot and Joyce and what have you. And the kind of defining move in many respects of that avant-garde group and many of the others working at the same time turns on a version of exactly this problem, right? Joyce, Eliot, Pound, the futurists in Italy, Dada famously in Switzerland during the war, are in a sense working in scorn of an audience, right? They are reading, they are working, they are painting, they are producing something that begins as a commodity that is legible only internally, that doesn't have an audience, but then has to create one. We don't think of Owen and Sassoon typically as sort of figures of the radical avant-garde, but I think they give us a version of this problem, right? That no longer does one write a poem to be presented to an audience. A poem has to create an audience. And it's not an accident that so many of the figures in this generation are also propagandists. They're also authors of manifestos. They are also literary critics who are, in a sense, providing the ground rules for reading. Now, Owen and Sassoon don't quite do that, right? They want, in a sense, to maintain that distance from any external gaze to make the point, right? They are not in the business of building their own institutions. But this is, in a strange sort of high altitude way, I think one of the most characteristic turns of these decades into the 20th century. A kind of literature which doesn't yet have an audience. And we can see it in the other arts as well, Picasso or Schoenberg or what have you, but has instead to find its reception or to postulate it into a kind of future. Just behind, yeah.
Could you say more about what Derek Jarman did to go beyond 1945 or 1952?
Yeah. There are all sorts of interesting complexities, I think, in Jarman's version. And I think one could point to a number of things. The use of Olivier as the old soldier is, of course, doing some very complicated work to establish the kind of circuit of memory, and the figure who survives, the Sassoon versus Owen. The use of the figure of the nurse, I think, does fascinating work around one version of this problem of comradeship. The self-recognition in the German soldier, this moment of identification, we think of as probably the most optimistic version of this bonding that goes on among the soldiers. But it is also true that it takes rather more disturbing forms as well. There is often a kind of misogyny in the rhetoric of Sassoon at his most vitriolic, and moments even in Owen, a tone in which gender becomes a marker for this difference between inclusion and exclusion, right? The figure of the beloved back home who doesn't understand, right? The figure of the German mother who doesn't know what has happened to her son. Often a figure of something approaching scorn. And I think Jarman is playing with that in fascinating ways. But most precisely, Jarman, of course, also goes back and uses where he can and splices against his own actors the archival footage of the First World War, and then slowly moves it out, right? So we get film stock from the Second War, and by the very end of the film, we've gone even past that into the present. And Jarman, excuse me?
What's the name of the film you're talking about?
Just Derek Jarman's War Requiem. It is basically a film set to the famous 1962 recording, the Decca version. It's a wonderful way to hear and see it once.
It wasn't at the same time that Owen was saying you can't possibly have any access to this. Wasn't it also a political message that this war is crazy, almost propaganda, about the idiocy of the generals that send people into machine guns, all massed together? So, I mean, it did have that other message.
Oh, absolutely. No, and Sassoon famously becomes a kind of militant, counter-militant in London. And in Sassoon's case, it's fascinating to read them together because they are of course close both personally and stylistically. There are moments at which even Sassoon's poetics seem to have been absorbed into a kind of propagandistic simplicity, right? Where the simple force of the iambs, the kind of metrics of the poem, do this work of just kind of thudding and trying to catch something of the rhythm of the scene, but more importantly, almost forswearing any ambiguity. The last thing Sassoon wants, he wants us to know we can't read. He also doesn't want to allow us to misread, right? We are forced to read properly the fact that we cannot read. Owen complicates that in some ways, and I think as with the first line, what passing bells for those who die as cattle, right? The deflation of that last word performs a slightly more subtle version of that same effect, I think.
To that guy who wrote this poem that said,
Yeah.
Who had a narrative that this war is a bunch of brave people going out, and whatever narrative is the dominant one of a time, the thinkers and people who have alternative experiences slowly find their way, and often through poetry, to say, there's something else going on here besides this. And I guess what's interesting you've added is that using the device of saying you can't do it as a way to actually reveal to you something that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah, and I think one sort of stepping back, one can see in certain respects the sort of corollary corollary to that on the other side. Owen famously, as you know from working through Strange Meeting, develops this device of the odd consonantal rhyme, the para rhyme, right, which manages to maintain, in a way, a more extensive rhyme without actually mapping identical sounds in the same way with line endings. He basically, I mean, he seems to have taken that trick or to have developed that sense from W.B. Yeats. And he quotes Yeats, uses him epigraphically in a few places. And Yeats subsequently had very strange things to say about both Owen in particular and war poetry. And in a way refused to engage in question and insisted that in fact most of this had to be read not primarily as poetry, but as some other species, some version of propaganda. But part of that reticence on Yeats's part, and in fact he has a few poems written during the war on the subject of war poetry, one on being asked to write a war poem or something like this, in which he refuses the gesture. In other words, Yeats, who knows nothing of the war, can't possibly presume to write about the war. And while he remains skeptical or suspicious of some of the poetry that claims its grounding of the war, he cannot offer some counterclaim. And I think one could see that more generally in the work of Yeats, which takes a remarkable turn at exactly this moment, the sort of arc of his great work from 1917, 1918, 1919, is much more formally elusive, often in the need to write its way around the war. You know, to produce a verse that, as it were, registers the fact of the war, but doesn't claim to take it on directly. Right, that has nothing to say in particular, but is nonetheless impossible. You know, it becomes impossible to talk about anything else. And perhaps most famously, of course, this becomes, in a way, the conundrum of the wasteland, in which T.S. Eliot, not having seen the war, having lived in London at the time, been working in the war's aftermath, in a bank in the city, literally dealing with the sort of settlements or non-settlements of the Treaty of Versailles and the currency crises and everything else. The poem is made by the war, but it can't possibly have anything to say about it, right? So what it becomes about, in a way, is the absence of that language to address or to refer to that which cannot possibly not be there. Right? So in a way that paradox cuts both ways and points us, I think, not only to the familiar canon of war poets, but also to a much more towering, in a way, poetic mainline of the interwar period.
This was great.
Thank you.